Good morning, everybody. I think this is, as mentioned by Ricardo, this is time for us to get into the substance and the main topics of this dialogue. We are going to focus in this panel on the international economic and political outlook. And we are going to look specifically to the potential for cooperation between China and Europe. As we heard in the previous interventions, China has become the second largest economy. Last year, 2010, it displaced Japan from that position. And according to some forecasts, it may become the largest economy, displacing, in this case, the US, in 2016, according to some other estimations, that will happen by 2020 or 2024, but the fact is that China is bound to be with us in a very prominent manner for the next decades. We also heard, particularly from Ambassador He, that China is, has a stake in European recovery. China is worried about the current difficulties the European countries are facing, and is worried because China is an important partner for Europe, and Europe is a key partner for China, among other reasons. As we heard before, more than 40% of China's investments abroad in developed countries come to Europe. So there is obviously a stake for both China and Europe to move out of the current financial difficulties and be in a position to strengthen their mutual collaboration. And to enlighten us on this particular topic, we have a very prominent and distinguished set of panelists. We have with us first Professor Jean-Pierre Leman, very well known by many of you, I'm sure, a good friend of ICTSD and of Bridges. Jean-Pierre is a professor of international political economy at IMD in Lausanne. He is also the founding member of the Evian Group, and he combines these responsibilities with a senior fellowship at the Funk Global Institute in Hong Kong. He writes extensively and intensively on global economic issues, and I'm sure that we will benefit from his insights on China and Europe as we move forward and as we try to face the current difficulties in the most appropriate manner. So, Jean-Pierre, if you please go ahead. Well, before that, let's see. We have 1 hour for this panel, but we're starting late because of the previous panels stole, from us part of our time. So we try to be as brief as possible, so that I will ask the panelists to speak no more than, say, 10 minutes, 15 minutes at the maximum, so that we have time for interaction with everybody in the room. So Jean-Pierre, please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, and thank you for your flattering remarks. I'm a great admirer of ICTSD and think that the work that it's doing is absolutely critical, and the whole symbolism of bridge building is very important, and especially in generating dialogue. We need dialogue, we need dialogue, we need dialogue, we need dialogue. Now, I have to say that what I understood that I would be speaking about is the international economic and political outlook and context in which the issues that we're talking about is occurring. And I must give a warning that my remarks are extremely gloomy and alarmist and depressing. So you can leave now. And I don't think that at the moment there's a light at the end of the tunnel. I think that in most instances, when you think there's a light at the end of the tunnel, it's in fact a train coming in the opposite direction. And part of it has to do with the fact that we really, and you know, this is a little bit jargon, but I think in this case it's true, are living in a totally unprecedented, sort of different paradigm. What we've seen at the end of the last century and beginning of this century is a series of simultaneous discontinuities, simultaneous revolutions, which can be summarized. One is the revolution in information and communications technology. We still do not know what the broader impact is going to be. There's no book that you can take off the shelf and say, this is what happens when you have this kind of, you know, as the late Peter Drucker said, it's not an industrial revolution, it's an intellectual revolution comparable in Europe to Gutenberg's Bible. And one of the points that I want to make is that while this session has been named economic and political, I think the most fundamental aspect, in fact, is social, social and systemic. And there are social forces that are being unleashed that are again, difficult to assess. Another revolution, of course, is the Chinese Revolution of 1978. In a few days' time, we'll be celebrating the 100th anniversary of the first modern Chinese Revolution with Sun Yat-sen in 1911. Then we had the Second Revolution in 1949. And the Third Revolution, 1978, arguably, is the one that's going to have the greatest global impact. You know, Zheng Bijian said that the most important decision the Chinese leadership took was to embrace globalization. And this embrace of globalization contrasts totally with the previous 150 years or so since the Opium War. And it's unprecedented in many respects. One of the things that comment was made that China is still a poor country. Never has the world's biggest economic power been also one of the poorest. You know, so it's true that China, in terms of aggregate GDP, will probably pass the United States in the next few years. But in terms of GDP per capita, it's still very far behind. So this is one of the elements that's unprecedented. Then we have, following on from China, what you could call a global market revolution. You know, it was the old days were quite easy for us. We said there's a first world, second world, and third world, and that's it. And very little contact between them. This has been exploded. And we now have one global market economy. And with countries like Brazil, for example, behaving in ways that one could never have imagined 20 or 30 years ago. So this, and what we're seeing, of course, now is the rise of these emerging economies. It's extraordinary. I go to Turkey quite often. I go to many of these places, Brazil, China, Indonesia, etc. And the sense of confidence that there is, the sense of enthusiasm, the sense of, it contrasts. I mean, I think that, you know, we should encourage European emigration to these parts of the world, if only for our psychological well-being, because it's far less depressing. Another major revolution that we're living through is the demographic revolution, and that at IMD I have courses which are called demographics, and I won't go into detail because that's not the point, but of this particular exercise. But you know, among other things, for example, we see this phenomenon of urbanization. For the first time, humanity is more urban than rural. This will continue. 70% of the population of the world in 2050 will be living in urban areas. What does that mean? I mean, we've never, ever, ever been there. In the millions of years that human beings have existed, we've been peasants. Now all of a sudden we're urbanized. We're really peasants living in urban areas. But anyway, that is one of the realities. Then these aspiring classes. This is a remarkable phenomenon. This is very encouraging, if you like. That's not the gloomy part, is when you see these hundreds of millions being lifted out of subsistence into consumption, and with the aspirations that they have. It's extraordinary, these developments that are taking place. Now, this is great, because it's reducing poverty, it's raising people to a greater sense of dignity, which is very important. It gives them the hope not only of having better clothes, but also better education for their children also, etc. But then what are the resource implications of this? And when you see the system of global governance that we have now, which is so shockingly bad, it's very difficult to be able to envisage that we're going to be able to manage these things. And yet we must. You can't say to the aspiring Indians or the aspiring Chinese, the aspiring Indonesians, sorry mate, too late, no cars. We've given up on those because of the pollution that it causes. You can't do that. So there are these aspirations which are very, very strong. How are they going to be met? And then, of course, we have this whole issue of climate change, which is new. I've seen a number of economic miracles in inverted commas. I spent part of my youth in Japan. I was in Korea from the 60s onwards, Taiwan, etc., etc. And, of course, they created pollution. In Japan, there were terrible, these Minamata disease and others, but they were localized. They weren't globalized. In fact, this is also part of the transition that we're living in right now, is that all of the problems that we face are global, but sovereignty is still national. Mm. And we have, and as my friend Ambassador He Jiafei was saying, that we need to have cooperation. Well, we sure as hell ain't got that for the time being. We have a mercantilist spirit, a zero-sum game kind of spirit, which results in the fact that the trade agenda, the climate change agenda, the food agenda, all of these important agendas are stalled. And the Tower of Babel is a rather good symbol of the kind of global governance that we're experiencing. Are you sure you want more? So, as I said, what I think we're seeing, I was in Dalian a couple of weeks ago for the World Economic Forum meeting, and there was a session assessing threats. And two of the threats that were seen as the most prominent, one is the backlash against globalization. I think that this is one of the things that while we're talking here about dialogue and creating a relationship between Europe and China, that the realities are that there's more and more and more and more anti-globalization that wants to tear this apart. And to start with, of course, in the United States. There's a very good article by Bruce Stokes recently on isolationism, and we see this trend taking place. The U.S. may no longer be the leader of globalization. Let's hope it doesn't become the leader of deglobalization, of which there's an actual threat now. I think there's a systemic challenge also in the sense, and confidence. Capitalism is, I think, at the worst crisis since the 1930s. Now, these things, I think, have to be recognized. The other great threat, by the way, that was recognized at Dalian is youth unemployment. And we've got to talk about that. We've got to talk about that. We've got to talk about that. Because there are, in some cases, I mean, it depends. In Spain, there's 45% youth unemployment. And you look at the Arab region, and in fact, even in China now, there are issues of unemployment or underemployment. In other words, employment that doesn't correspond to your levels of education and so on and so forth. So these are critical issues that we need to talk to. And if I can make a suggestion to ICTSD, that maybe in your next bridges, that we have a special discussion with and on youth. Because there's a lot of good things that are happening. The technology, the opening up of markets, and so on, so on, so on. But I'm very inspired by a remark that President Lula, former President Lula made. He said, how will we explain to the next generation that we had so much and we did so little? And I think, this is it, that these crises are man-made. They're not imposed. Let me say it to, I don't know if there's a representative here from the European Union, but if so, then he or she may want to leave during the next 2 minutes. When I say something about Europe, and given the fact that this is part of the dialogue, and Jiafei talked about the EU as a strategic, or Europe as a strategic partner, I'm going to make a very provocative remark. I think increasingly it's clear there's no Europe. You know, it's unraveling. I think what we're seeing is that, you know, for example, when you get the economists who say what we need to have is a Eurozone, Eurobond with fiscal union, etc. But what about the people? They don't want that. It's been clear now, Europe has been very badly sold to Europeans. There's a very strong sense of rejection. When they tried to impose, it's all been top-down. When they tried to impose a constitution, it was rejected by the French and the Dutch through a referendum and probably would have been rejected by others. So you can't all of a sudden have people in the background there saying, oh, let's concoct a Euro bond, etc., without engaging the people. And this is one of the big problems. The other thing also is that, you know, our treaties, that particularly the Lisbon Treaty, is not worth the paper it was signed on. It was a rather thick thing. You see what's happening in this crisis. Where's the European leadership? Yeah. You know, it's Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy. But why did we have this treaty, and why do we have a European president? And I would like to test in this room how many people know his name. Yeah, he's probably one of the, when we talk about political leadership crisis, he's probably one of the most outstanding entities that there is. So, you know, all of this implies, I think my view is that it's a somewhat alarmist presentation of the world. I think it's a realistic one, that what we have to avoid is to be in a sense of denial, and to recognize that this cooperation, for example, that He Jianfei was talking about, is something that's not going to come about by a magic wand. It's going to have to be worked at. And it's going to have to be worked at, particularly to make sure also that we bring people along. Let me just finish by saying, you know, it's in this room, we have people committed to cooperation. But there's a lot of people outside this room who have feelings of anxiety because they don't know. You know, if you go out into the rural areas or even the provincial areas of Europe and you talk about the Chinese are coming, you know, that may be very well, it may be creating jobs, etc., but it's a fear to a certain extent of the unknown. Laura Tyson wrote something once. She said it was criticizing business schools, but I think it could be criticizing business associations and so on and so forth, that we fail to sell globalization to the globe. And that is something I think we recognize that we absolutely must do in order to create these platforms for confidence building that are going to be so necessary for collaboration. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre, for this very interesting and also very provocative remarks. And now I'd like to give the floor to our friend Fulai Chen. Mr. Chen is with the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP. He's the head of research in the area of science and technology. So, Mr. Chen, you have the floor.
谢谢主席先生，也要感谢 ICTSD， 请我到这跟大家介绍一下有关绿色经济以及科技方面的一些在国际上的一些大的格局，供来自中国的同胞和在座的瑞士朋友作为参考。我的介绍呢分两个部分，一个部分呢是关于绿色经济这么一个概念，另外一部分呢是讲关于这个绿色科技方面的问题。那么首先呢，我想讲一下绿色经济。联合国环境规划署UNEP 是在2008年的10月份推出了绿色经济这么一个全球性的倡议。那么当时的背景呢，是大家知道是那个全球的金融和经济危机。在这个金融和经济危机的背后呢，还存在着多重的全球性的危机。那么这些危机当时还包括能源危机，因为能源价格非常高；粮食危机，还包括气候危机， 以及生物多样性方面的危机。所以整个世界当时是面临着多重的危机。那么在这么一个大的背景之下，联合国环境署推出了绿色经济这么一个倡议。这个倡议的它的主要的一个想法呢，就是鼓励政府和企业呢，通过对于这个投资进行转向，来能够解决或者应对这些多重危机。那么这个投资转向什么一个意思呢？就是把这个投资呢转向一些新兴的战略产业，特别是一些跟环境非常相关的一些重要的行业。那么在我们环境署的研究当中呢，我们是考察了10个重要的部门，这些部门包括再生能源，包括制造业当中的一些清洁的技术，也包括绿色交通。那绿色交通里头包括2个部分，一个呢是低碳的、低污染的、低排放的新型的汽车，另外一方面呢是公共交通大力发展公共交通。那么还有呢就是这个绿色建筑也是一大块。那么除了这个以外呢，我们知道这个另外一个很重要的一个部门呢是废弃物的处理、回收、再制造remanufacturing。还有呢就是绿色的农业或者可持续的农业，还有这个渔业方面的一些可持续的一些管理，还有林业这方面，还有水资源，包括旅游业，这10个主要的经济行业，我们作为这个投资转向的重要的目标。那么除了这个10个行业之外呢，我们还考察了在城市这么一个层面，在城市这个层面呢，怎么样来推动绿色经济？因为城市呢，它不是一个行业，城市它是牵涉到各方面的部门，城市牵涉到能源，城市牵涉到建筑，城市也牵涉到这个交通废物处理等等。那么城市也是非常重要。我们是希望呢鼓励政府和企业呢关注这些部门的绿色化，以及呢如何使这个在这方面的投资呢能够推动经济的增长，使这些方面的投资成为新的经济增长点，或者说是成为新的经济增长的引擎。这是一个主要的概念。那么这个概念呢，跟以往的传统的对于绿色经济的理解有所不同。传统上的理解呢，往往是简单的把这个经济活动呢，把它要局限或者是要遵守这个环境方面的一些标准呢，要遵守一些环境方面的一些政策规章制度等等，这也没有错但是呢，我们这个绿色经济这么一个概念呢，它的一个重点呢，实际上是更加强调的是如何从这个绿色当中求增长，从绿色当中呢求得经济增长的机会。那么在2009年的9月份呢，联合国大会呢通过一个决议，把这个绿色经济呢作为里约20峰会，明年的里约20 Rio +20 峰会的2个主要议题其中一个议题这样也就是说，这个绿色经济的倡议呢已经得到全世界的一个关注那么现在目前呢，很多政府很多 NGO 很多这个企业包括非常关注这个里约20峰会呢，能够在这个绿色经济方面，能够产生怎么样的成果那么从这个 UNEP 我们这个环境署本身来说呢，我们下一段的工作呢，是给一些有兴趣的国家， 来提供一些技术的支持，特别是关注一些政府的政策如何能够有助于推动各个国家迈向绿色经济的这么一个发展途径啊。这是有关绿色经济的这部分。下面呢，我想介绍一下关于这个绿色科技方面的问题。绿色科技呢，概括的来讲，目前呢，发达国家呢，他们在绿色科技方面呢，大部分的这个专利权呢，还是在他们的手上啊。发达国家还是占有了绿色专利的这个大部分，但是呢，新兴国家，包括中国在内，他们正在迎头赶上，在一些重要的领域啊，包括像太阳能啊、风能啊等等，已经是在迎头赶上。但是呢，对于全世界大多数的发展中国家，特别是低收入的发展中国家，他们在这个绿色科技方面呢，存在的几个重要的一些障碍啊，可以说有这么几个方面。首先呢，相当多的发展中国家，特别是低收入国家，他们不知道有哪些绿色的科技啊，能够解决他们什么样的问题，也不知道如果利用这些绿色科技呢，会存在哪些风险。所以呢，这是有关这个知识面的问题啊，所谓的 lack of knowledge， 这是一方面。第二一个方面呢，就是这个财力的问题了，就是所谓的 affordability 的问题，能不能负担得起这些绿色技术的它的这个获取，不光是获取，还有一个deployment， 还有一个 service， 不好意思，这两个一下子转不过来。这是一个 affordability 的问题，就是这个有没有这个财力能够负担这些科技。第三方面的一个障碍呢，就是相当多的国家，它也许能够买来这些科技，但是呢，它没有这个自主生产的能力，生产有关的设备，或者是生产有关的零部件啊，这些绿色科技的这个设备跟零部件，在当地的生产能力缺乏。这是另外一个障碍。那么还有一个重要的障碍呢，就是缺少有关的技术人员、技工缺少有关的这个工人来使用这些绿色的技术。这是相当多的这个发展中国家呢，他们存在的这个绿色技术方面存在的一些障碍。实际上这些障碍呢，对于中国的企业走出去来说，应该想办法把它们变成机遇。那么接下来最后呢，我想讲一下可能的几个应对这些障碍的一些方法啊，包括国际上的一些方法，或者是在国家层面的一些方法。第一个呢，针对这个相当多的国家没有这方面的这个认知，没有这方面的知识呢，应该是不是可以考虑有个国际的一个所谓的clearing house 清算的一个机制哈，能够提供有关绿色经济的这个绿色科技的这方面的信息，能够广泛的传播绿色科技的这个讯息，特别是针对低收入国家，这是一方面。第二方面呢，是不是可以考虑有一个国际的一个融资的机制，能够帮助最不发达的国家来获取、来使用、推广这些绿色的科技，这是融资方面的。第三一个方面呢，就是政府对于各个国家政府来说呢，我们是鼓励他们对于这个绿色科技的这个研发research and development 增加这个投入增加投入。那么还有一个方面呢，是不是可以考虑，就是说鼓励有关的专利的拥有人来捐献有关的这个专利来捐献 donate 那个有关的知识产权，特别是有一些知识产权能够对于相当大的这个人口带来广泛的这个利益的这些专利、这些知识产权，那么是不是能够鼓励他们捐出这些东西？那么还有一个方面呢，就是加强对于当地的这个技术工人的培训那么另外一方面呢， 对于中国企业来说比较相关的就是加强政府或者民间对于这个南合作的支持，南合作的支持，南方跟南方这个 South-South Cooperation。那么还有一方面呢，就是中国企业在走出去的过程当中呢，是不是可以考虑也是对于当地能不能就是说提高当地的生产有关设备跟那个零部件的能力？这样的话呢，会使这些投资呢，对于当地的政府，跟老百姓来说更具有吸引力，使它能够产生当地自己生产的能力。那么最后一点呢，就是充分利用当地的这个知识，特别是这个在资源管理和农业生产方面的知识，因为这些知识呢，可能是非常当地化的，非常需要利用当地的知识，而不是外来引进的知识。才会产生比较理想的效果就说这些，谢谢。
Thank you, thank you very much, Mr. Shen, and thank you for underlining not only the opportunities but also the challenges that, in particular, developing countries face as we move into a green economy and the development of green technologies. And now I'd like to give the floor to Professor Quan Li. Professor Li is a professor and director of the program of International Conflict and Cooperation of Texas University. Professor Li, have the floor.
Thank you for the introduction, and I also want to thank ICTSD and Shuaihua and his very capable staff for making my visit possible. Now, I'm an academic, so you may wonder what academics can do, and they teach and they do stuff, right? So I can't tell you much about how you do business, but what I want to share is what we know from political economy studies of FDI, foreign direct investment, thank you, in international business, political science, and economics. And what we know from those studies of how political risk affects foreign direct investment and how you should deal with them. And I want to address one very interesting puzzle for Chinese investment, and which is sort of something to take home for you today. Okay. If I can make this work. Okay, this one works, that one doesn't. Okay, so one puzzle that I want to talk to you today about is that if you look at the studies of OECD investments, and not only that, but also foreign investment from other developing countries, and they really care about property rights protection and the quality of institutions in the countries where they invest. And they care very much about that. But if you look at the similar studies of Chinese outward investment, it shows evidence otherwise. And actually, a couple of statistical studies and also some survey evidence indicates that Chinese FDI has been attracted to countries with bad institutions and high political risk, or they don't care about it, and which is really a puzzle and makes you wonder why, right? This doesn't mean that Chinese investors don't care about losing money. There must be a reason for that, and that's the sort of the answer to that is the main thesis of my talk today. And the other thing is that what lessons can China learn from the puzzle? And I believe the lessons I'm going to offer gleaned from the literatures in international business, political science, and economics will be applicable to European investments in China as well. But mainly I want to target the Chinese investors here. Okay, so just to share with you the punchline, because we have a time constraint, the Chinese firms, the answer to the puzzle is that Chinese firms exhibit both inexperience and lack of attention in understanding and managing political risk. All right, I'm going to show some evidence to verify that. And this poses a sharp contrast against multinational enterprises from industrialized countries. And the negative effects of this will be it hurts the success of the Chinese firms that have invested abroad, and also the attempt of other Chinese investors that are seeking to make foreign investments abroad. All right? So we're going to have some useful lessons learned from political economy studies of FDI. All right. So first of all, I'll give you a basic of political risk, and I'm sure all of you know that, but I just want to cover the basis. All right, political risk is an important consideration for OECD investors, and usually they purchase political risk insurance. All right, the political risk insurance industry typically characterizes political risk into three categories: so the war and political violence, and expropriation and the contract breach, as well as transfer risk, whether you can send your money home once you make the money. And for one example, as one of the political risk consulting firm in the United States that has a big name among the academics. The reason why they have big name among the academics because they're willing to sell data to us, and others are not willing to. So for those of you who are working in the political risk consulting industry, you want to make your name with the academics, sell data to us, and not holding them. So they have a country risk score. In a country risk score, they assign 50% of the weight to political risk, and the other 50% to financial and economic risk. So they pay a lot of attention to that. And this is the list of factors that they consider as part of the factors that cause political risk, right? So you can find a whole list of them, and they're not surprising, okay? So the one thing that they do, foreign investors can do, is to manage your political risk, all right? So government does a lot to that. And so we can see the US Overseas Private Investment Corporation, the OPIC, and the EDC in Canada, and MIGA at World Bank, and various private insurers. They all provide political risk insurance to cover. Okay, and this is very important. So some of the examples you can see that for a long period of time, even until today, that firms are exposed to expropriation risk. And firms lose money. Firms go to their insurance underwriter, and they file claims, and they get covered. And I don't know if the Chinese investors are aware of that, or all of them are aware of that, or some of them do that, or some of them don't want full coverage. So this is certainly something that you should be aware of. And so the same thing, and I'll skip that because of time. The Chinese firms should also be concerned, of course, right? If investors from the more successful countries and more successful investors and feel the need to cover political risk, why shouldn't the Chinese investors do the same? And as we can see, a large literature shows that host government policies can never be fully credible. You can't trust the government, right? Or you can trust this government, but you may not trust the government forever, because you may have good relations with this government, but you cannot guarantee you're going to have good relations with the governments and the future governments in the future. And one thing that we learned in political science, economics, is that governments always find reasons to renege, and they change policies. There are abundant examples of that, and you live in Europe, you know that full well. But the Chinese investors should be aware of that. It's not just with Europe, it's also with any country in the world. All right, so Chinese firms have gone out to about 160 countries. They're facing varying levels and different types of political risk at different locations. All right, so Chinese investors should care about that, okay? But Chinese firms are not well prepared. And I'll show you something in a minute. They focus on technical problems as the main hurdles to investment, right? Exactly the opposite pattern to what you see with the service with European investors or American investors. Okay, the other reason why you should really care about that is that you would imagine in political science we learned for a long time that democratic government helps us to protect our rights, right? It's been a well-established pattern. Now, what I want to show you here is something slightly to the opposite, or add a caveat to that claim. this is the data looking at all the expropriation acts against foreign direct investment from 1960 to 1990. We're extending the data right now to the present. And this covers 76 countries. Now, at the horizontal axis, you have the level of democracy of a country. The idea is that the more democratic you are, the less likely you're going to expropriate against foreign investors. As you can see, indeed, they have fewer expropriation acts. However, democratic governments also expropriate, right? That's the main caveat. If you believe you're investing in a mature democracy with a score of 10, like the United States, Germany, you might also face expropriation risk. It's not like they don't expropriate against you. It's just that they don't find a good excuse and good opportunity to get away with it. So the Chinese investors should be careful about that. And I'll skip this. And then if you look at the Chinese investment, it's distributed all over the world, right? This is a survey conducted by the China Council of Trade Promotion of the Chinese investors. And the investment of Chinese outward investment scattered around the world. So you do face a variety of different kinds of political risks. Now, this is really fascinating. So I take this from the survey of 2010, okay, by the China Council for Promotion of International Trade. As I mentioned earlier, lower scores indicating investors really care about it, higher scores indicating that you are less concerned about that political item. As you can see, the one that generates political risk is the one that at the very bottom, that you care about the regulation and the risk. Okay, not very bottom, I take it back. So it's 3.32. But they care most about is financing problems, right? These are the, one thing that's very important to be aware of, these are the responses by Chinese firms that have invested abroad. So these people they care most about are the technical problems, not political risk problems, and very different from European investors or American investors. Now, if you look at, okay, they also asked some Chinese firms that why you didn't invest in the United States or North America, Canada, okay? Look at the very bottom one, that 40%, the highest proportion of investors. The main reason is what? I don't know the rules of the game. I can't deal with the risk. You can't read that. It's very bad quality of, it's a picture, so you can't read that. But just trust me with my words. So because I don't have the knowledge to understand the rules and regulations associated with the country and the market. Okay? So what do we observe here? What we observe here is a very interesting pattern, right? The guys who have invested, they don't care much about it because they think they already made it. They care more about technical problems. The guys who haven't made it, they can't go in there because they don't know the political risk, right? So that's what I meant earlier, is that they either lack of attention with the firms that have invested or inexperience with the firms that try to invest, all right? So, okay, so Chinese firms are no different from other firms, right? People always argue, one explanation some people offered for why the puzzle at the very beginning, that Chinese firms select low-quality investment areas, is because, well, they may come from a country where bribery and network and is very popular, and so you know how to do that. So you enter countries where you can take advantage of that. I think it's a very crappy argument. It's assuming that firms are so in favor of corruption, they just want to win all the time. But the problem we learn from political science, you can't win all the time because you never know where the corruption is going to end. You always pay more and more, right? It never ends. So that assumes that actually the investors are now quite rational over the long run. So now we know that Chinese firms, they seek the market, right? They seek resources, they jump the tariff, they seek efficiency, right? But the Chinese firms that have invested tend to rely on diaspora networks to manage political risk, ignoring other means. Okay, this is not very good, right? And the Chinese firms that seek to invest, but find the lack of knowledge about political risk environment the biggest hurdle, right? That's a very important lesson, I believe, okay? Now, this adds to this a compounding problem, make the puzzle even, the consequences, implications of the puzzle even worse. The compounding problem is that we all know in international business literature that as a foreign firm, you invest in a foreign country, you have a foreignness liability. I have a foreignness liability right now. You know, I was born in China, raised in China, and then I went to the States, and then now I'm in Geneva. I'm a foreigner. I have a foreignness liability. So I walk around the streets trying to ask for something, and one guy told me, I don't speak English. I almost wanted to say, do you speak Chinese? But of course, it wouldn't work. Okay, so anyway, the compounding problem for Chinese investors is that most of these investments are by state-owned firms. The state-owned firms, they come from a background of socialist command economy and government policies promoting those full outward investment, favoring the monopoly status. And that's really make the local firms very jittery about what that means. The other thing is that the ideological differences and national security concerns have created a lot of trouble for Chinese investors. In the United States, we heard a lot about that. And so the foreignness liability problem for Chinese investors is even stronger than other investors from other countries. Okay, and so this makes the newness and the lack of experience a worse problem because the need to manage political risk for Chinese firms is even greater, right? You need to overcome those hurdles. Okay, so what do we learn from here? What we learn from here is that the overall message is that there's no magic bullet to solve your problem. And we have learned a lot of useful methods and suggestions from international business, political science, economics, about how to manage political risk, as we'll tell you in a minute. But as you will see, for each of those methods, there's a caveat. Okay, I'll try to be brief here. So the first lesson, of course, is pay attention, right? Get risk insurance. Don't be cheap, all right? The caveat, of course, is that it's not always the first best solution. Now, even with the expropriation risk and political violence insurance, you don't get covered the full amount of your investment. You only get covered a proportion of it. So this is not the first best solution, all right? Now, the other caveat, of course, and so for some investors, they figure I'm covered, so there's moral hazard problem, right? So where you get covered, you become a little bit reckless, you pay less attention, and that's a problem, okay? Second lesson we learned is that get a local partner via joint venture to manage your host politics. This is very popular for Chinese and as well as OECD investors. We all do that. Now, what's the problem? The problem here is that we have a lot of studies showing, well, local partners can help you manage political risk. Local partners can be cheating on you, and so they may act opportunistically and make you lose money, and they gain the money. And that's a real problem, okay? Now, the other lesson is that you seek help from the home governments, right? Chinese government is doing that, US government is doing that, Canadian government is doing that, and to lower the risk. Now, what's the caveat? Depending on the nature of political relations. And we did some econometric studies showing two countries that have good political relations help to promote investment, right? That's good, but what if you involve your government with a country that the government has a bad relationship with? I think it's going to backfire. And that may even create a lot more trouble for you. Now, the evidence for US firms that try to seek help from US government, and actually the outcomes are very, very mixed. It's not always come out positive for them. So be very careful with that. And the other thing is that home government may use firms for political purposes. The US government did that a while back. I don't know if they're still doing that right now. Certainly, I would like to know. And this creates a great deal of national security concerns. And this certainly is the problem for the Chinese firms right now, and overcoming that hurdle. Okay, another lesson. Another lesson is to engage the host governments politically and legally. Okay, so the issue here, now I want to go back a minute on this. One thing that actually is really, really important is that there are a lot of open opportunities if you know how to work the system, that you can actually you can get actually a lot of out of the host government. But the problem with the Chinese investors, they just don't have the knowledge to deal with that, which is really a shame. So the caveat here is that you really need to know the rules of the game. So for example, in the United States, if you do a campaign contribution via your local partner, will be okay. If you lobby the government, go try to tell the government what you want, what are the problems, and what you can do for the senator or the congressman's electoral district, creating more jobs for them and make them more likely to win in election. And that's certainly much, much better and less risky than paying bribery to the politicians in the United States, right? So this is very important to keep in mind. And the other caveat is that this is really, we forgot about this. And I think this, we're going to working on a project right now on this, is that being too involved with an incumbent government is really very dangerous. Being too involved with the government is that after transition to a new government or to a new regime, it's going to backfire. You can get a lot of legitimacy problem. And one thing we show in the expropriation data is that most of the expropriations against foreign investors occur within the 3 years of either a transition to a new regime, political regime, or a transition to a new leader. And you lose a lot from that. Okay, the other lesson is that we need to learn to build international and host domestic coalitions among investors and stakeholders to manage risk. The United States learned, US investors learned very quickly from that. They suffered tremendously in the 60s and 70s after waves of expropriations. What they learned is to build these coalitions. They build coalitions among investors to lobby together, and they build coalitions with the local communities to lobby the government, and turn out to be very, very successful. Okay? Now, the caveat about this is, of course, you face collective action problem. How do you get the investors to organize together? Okay? And the other problem is that if you're too active, too aggressive, be careful. You may lead to create a lot of nationalism. All right? Finally, you need to learn to engage local communities and leaders to create win-win outcomes, particularly in terms of when your production generates a lot of externalities, especially environmental pollution and possibly human rights violations in countries where there's a dictator. They don't care whether you hire child labor or not. So you need to be very careful about that. And which the caveat, of course, is that you need to expand resources, which means you can't always try to maximize profit now. You need to think down the road. What if I want to maximize the stream of revenue for over long haul? So you should spend some money to improve the quality of living for your workers, and that may actually help you. So fundamentally, there's no single magic bullet that allow you to manage the risk, but you should always have a plan for different contingencies. And the Chinese government firms need to understand and manage political risk better, and the government needs to be careful how it plays a role. And I think this is very, very important. Firms need to know the rules of the game in the host. They need to develop some research expertise. As you will see, the problem here is that you really need to know your own firm, right? You need to know your own market, because the risks are different depending on where you're investing. And you should always have actionable plan. And finally, I want to show you something of a dissertation just finished by a PhD student in business, and where she's looking at how to manage risk. If you're caught in a war, you already invested. Now, this is very relevant for Chinese investors. You already invested in the country. The country suddenly got into a civil war. What do? It turns out the business literature has very, very little on that, right? On one of the dissertations I show him, then what you need to think about is all the sort of plans you need to devise, and whether you pull out your asset right now, and whether you pull out partially, whether you pull your workers out first, and who do you pull out first, right? You need to have actionable plans. Okay, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Li. I think this is a very enlightening analysis of political risk and Chinese investments abroad. And I think that with Professor Li, we have completed our round of speakers. We had expected Mr. Van den Hoven to join us. He's from Business Europe, but at the last minute he couldn't make it. I think we have had three very interesting and also complementary interventions from Jean-François Leman speaking about Jean-Pierre Leman speaking about this dichotomy between the global challenges and the national responses, with Professor Shen underlined the importance of the green economy and the development of green technologies, and Professor Li, as we saw it just most recently, looking at foreign investments, Chinese investments abroad, and the challenges they face. We have some, say, between 10 to 15 minutes to interact with the audience. So I'd like to offer the floor to any of you who would like to ask questions from the panelists or make comments. So the floor is open. I think somebody will help us with the, yes, Natalia will help us with the microphone. And yes, I know whether to look. Any comments? Yes. The gentleman, this. Well, the other one. It's next. You will be next, Mr. Etienne.
Thank you very much.
If you identify yourself, that would be great. Okay.
Thank you very much. I'm Maurice, Ambassador, Uganda. The last speaker actually stopped where I thought it was a very serious point, that when there is a conflict, what do you do? Actually, there is a company in Ivory Coast which got that problem. Is it Nestle? It had invested heavily, but then the civil war came, and it lost a lot. And so how do you handle that problem? Because you just stopped when I thought it was, it needed some explanation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. What I suggest is that we take a few questions and then we'll ask our panelists to respond at the end. Monsieur Etienne,
Thank you very much. Gilbert Etienne from the Graduate Institute. I very much enjoyed all these presentations, but I wonder whether we should not also add one comment. You know, emerging countries, particularly China, but also to some extent India, Brazil, and others, are in a rather different situation than what we have gone through in Western Europe, because these countries are exposed to the shadows of our industrial revolution, you know, various labor conditions, fake goods, corruption, plenty of other slums, etc. But at the same time, they are facing the beginning of the society of consumption, which in Western Europe started only after 1945. So you see, the two phenomena are playing at the same time. True, the society of consumption is still much below than from what it has reached in Western Europe by 1975, but this creates much more complex problems than what we have faced in our countries. On the one hand, the present growth rate in China, India, and others is much higher than what we had in our industry, in our 30 years after the Second World War. On the other hand, income disparities were considerably reduced until 75. Now it's, of course, rising. Whereas in those countries, income disparities are increasing. And there are many other problems at the social level, you know, attitudes, traditions changed rather slowly in Europe from the beginning of the 20th century. Now in China and India, you have the very abrupt emergence of new customs, new practices, break of traditional life. Now, so all these things make the whole process, in a way, more complex than what we had in our past experiences. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Etienne. Any further questions, comments? Well, if not, I'd like to offer the floor back to our panelists, and let me start with Jean-Pierre. Maybe you want to make some final comments and address some of the issues, please.
Yes, I mean, perhaps specifically to Gilbert Etienne's point, absolutely. I mean, I think that the speed at which developments are taking place is part of the unprecedented nature of the context that we're in at the moment, and it has one of the changes taking place at an hallucinating pace. 100 million people per year are moving from subsistence to consumption. So that when you multiply it 10 years reaches a billion people, and it's increasing. At the same time, there's this element of the information revolution that I was talking about. So there's much more access to information. I think what you were also suggesting in terms of the problems is the problems that we see in all of these countries is rapidly rising inequality, and that feeds in also to the information bit and the aspirations. So it's both for the countries concerned and the impact that they will have elsewhere. It's a daunting challenge, which is why we come back. We need the collaboration, we need coordination, we need a different form of governance than we have. Having said that, it also, as I said, provides enormous opportunities, and perhaps I can just tell a quick anecdote that I live in Lausanne. In most parts of the world that I go to, they say to me, where do you live? And I say Lausanne in Switzerland, and they say, oh yes, it's got this very nice medieval bridge. And I said, no, that's Lucerne, and I'm in Lausanne. One of the two countries that know Lausanne and recognize it immediately, one of course, is Turkey, because the Treaty of Lausanne was what is in 1923 established the Republic of Turkey, so they recognize Lausanne. And the other place, of course, is China, because they know that the head office of the International Olympic Committee is in Lausanne. And in fact, until 2008, I was a very privileged guest in China, because they thought, this guy lives in Lausanne and he must be very influential and will be able to sort of swing the Olympics for us. But Lucerne, which I don't go to that often, but I was in about a year ago, and I arrived at the station, and I thought I was in Mumbai. It was just absolutely full of Indians. And these were clearly Indians of what I would call the aspiring classes. And I said, why are there so many Indians? And then, of course, it was explained to me that many Bollywood films are made in the Lucerne area, and that sort of many Indian tourists come to the spaces where the Bollywood films were made as part of the exchange package. So these, when I said that my presentation was very gloomy, and I think you looked gloomy after I spoke, at the same time, this is what I want to point out, is the opportunities. I mean, this is fantastic. To think that you would have Indians visiting Lucerne and so on. So, Gilbert is absolutely right. We have to recognize, and particularly we in the advanced countries, that people in the emerging economies are living at a pace which is just absolutely hallucinating, with multiple challenges that they're facing, and that this is why the process of adjustment is so important. But if we can come out of all that, I think we can look forward to an extremely fantastic world. And I agree with you, by the way, about I'm very inspired by young, green-oriented entrepreneurs. That's the future. These are the people we should really be encouraging and looking at, and so on. So there are all sorts of possibilities out there, but somehow or other we've got to incentivize and sustain.
Thank you very much, Jean-Pierre. Thank you for this information about the role of Lucerne in Bollywood movies. Mr. Chen, Professor Chen, just briefly, because we are running out of time and been called to order already.
谢谢。我简单的针对这个刚才提出的这个消费的问题，还有关于这个社会公平的问题， 做一些反馈。刚才这位先生讲到，在这个新兴经济体里头呢，有相当一部分人已经是等于是转化成中产阶级，然后这个消费的水平在逐渐增加。但是呢，我觉得我们同时还要认识到，在这些新兴的国家当中呢，新兴经济体当中，还有相当一部分的贫困人口。那么总体来说呢，他们的这个消费水平还是相当低，所以呢，这就存在着一个怎么样在这些新兴经济体内部调整这个消费空间啊，所谓这个 consumption space， 也就是说，这个怎么样适当的抑制中产阶级它这个不断增长的消费需求，同时呢又适当的增加这个低收入群体贫困人口他们的这个增长空间，这是一个方面。还有一个就是发展中国家跟发达国家之间的这个发展空间问题，因为发达国家它的人均消费量是要高出这个发展中国家许多倍。那么在全球这个层面来说呢，我觉得这个有这个必要来调整发达国家跟发展中国家之间的这个发展空间。最后一个关于这个社会公平的问题，这使我想到，就是说咱们这个中国的企业啊，去国外去海外投资啊，是不是也应该考虑，就是说能不能为当地的这个社会公平做出自己应有的贡献啊？这具体可以体现在，比如说在咱们这个海外投资的项目当中，怎么样来扶持当地的中小企业？因为我们知道中小企业它是这个创造就业的一个大户啊。那么同时呢，在咱们这个海外投资的这些业务当中呢，怎么样能够尽量的使这个当地的贫困人口、弱势群体能让他们得到这个益处，能让他们参与相关的这个投资活动，特别是包括当地的年轻人啊，来创造当地的就业。那么如果我们能够对这些方面做出一定的贡献的话，我想对于中国的企业在海外投资呢，减少当地的有关的政治风险呢，也会有益处的啊。谢谢。
Thank you very much, Mr. Shen. Professor Li, please.
Okay, I'll be very brief. And about the first question, and how do you handle political risk when you're caught in a war? And I want to make a general point in way of answering the question. And one is that you can't eliminate the risk completely. Here's a very simple reason. If you can eliminate it, which means you know when it's going to happen, and you don't. You know it, then you will get rid of it, but you don't. It's a probabilistic world. We don't know when war occurs. Second, it's very, very important to be prepared. This may come as shocking news, but actually a lot of the US firms not even prepared in that. And for one very simple reason that once Economic Intelligence Unit did a survey of European and US firms, the survey was done at Switzerland, at Geneva, one of the economic forum. And it turns out, and these investors say, many of them don't have a political risk manager in their firm. Why not? The reason why, very simple, because they purchased political risk insurance. They think it's going to cover it all. But this is very, very bad, because political risk insurance that you purchase, all the things you purchase from consulting firm, the risk score I show you are very, very aggregate, country-specific. They can't deal with the specifics of your firm, your attributes. It's very, very different. And so the important thing is that to try to have some research expertise, get some consulting, some academics that we do is formulate forecasting models and get them on board to share their research with you. If you are prepared, it's much, much better than being taken by surprise. Most of the losses occur because you are surprised. You cannot, if you're prepared, you can minimize your losses, okay? Now, the second point about income inequality, and we have shown very convincingly in political science that income inequality is really, really a bad thing, right? It comes with capitalism because we want efficiency. We have to give people incentives to produce and work hard. Then income inequality is a necessary evil, but it has gotten out of control, And in the United States, we have the highest level income inequality in the history. Now, what's the implication? And I think the solution is very simple, but the solution is not incoming. Here's the solution. The solution is that the poor people on the poverty line, they need to have organized political power, and they're not organized. So you talk about U.S. elections, and it's frustrating. All the look at the Republican primary, anti-intellectual. How a C-level student can be a front runner, and C-level student can be the president. I don't understand it, right? How can that be? And that's just awful. And so what you end up with administrations that don't care about the poor. And the poor, what's the solution? You either get organized legally, get your rights back, and get covered somehow, or you engage in rebellion. And we have shown that in sociology, political science, you either get covered or you fire a gun at somebody, right?
Thank you very much. Well, with that advice on get organized politically, I'd like to close this session and thank our distinguished panelists for a very interesting, to the point, and challenging discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Miguel, and thank you, panelists. We are now serious.